Welcome to the Not Boring Tech Writer, a podcast sponsored by Knowledge Owl. Together, we explore topics and hear from other writers to help inspire us, deepen our skills, and foster our distinctly not boring tech writing community. Hello, my lovely fellow Not Boring Tech Writers. I'm Kate Mueller, and today's guest, I have to say, also has a storied past. So I love interviewing people who kind of got into tech writing by accident after they did something else. And today's guest, I think, definitely qualifies as that. She was educated as a biologist and did postdoc research and then slowly moved into bioinformatics before kind of ending up in tech writing, and then also ended up being a people manager at some point in there. So lots of unexpected twists and turns. And you know how much I love a good, not boring, twisty and turny story. And I'm very, very excited to welcome to the pod today, Sue Brandt. Sue, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the talk.
So excited to have you. So for our listeners, I just spoiled a little of it, I think, but can you give us your sort of tech writer villain origin story? How did you get into tech writing in the beginning?
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there anyone who actually planned to be in tech writing from early on? It seems like everyone just falls into it by strange and wonderful means, and I've heard all sorts of stories. So my story is that I was looking for a new role. I was doing postdoc research and I enjoyed it, but it was really stressful to have to keep applying for new grants and not knowing if you still had a job in a few months. So I had no idea really what I wanted to do instead, and I was looking at everything within about a 40-kilometer radius from my home. And someone was looking over my shoulder and sort of pointed to something and said, "You could do that."
The infamous tech writer, "Oh, you could do that." And lo and behold, you could do that. And you did.
I was super lucky because the hiring manager was somebody who kind of took a chance on me because I was writing about how you use software to program hardware. And I didn't know anything about software or hardware or tech writing. But somehow she kind of twigged that I might be good at this and gave me a chance. So as I say, I was super lucky.
Oh, this makes me really love that we're trying to talk about how you get hired today, because it's funny how those little moments of somebody maybe taking a chance on you ended up into something that worked as a career. I have a similar thing about getting into software in general, I would say. I was teaching college level writing for a while and I got burnt out on it. And I took this temp job at a call center. And as a result of that, ended up teaching myself database design and architecture, which kind of led me more into the technical realm and ultimately led me into tech writing, among other things. But it was just a complete accident. It was just I don't know what to do right now. So I'm going to take this totally random job that I'm not totally sure I'm good at, but I'm just going to do it for a while. And then it gradually built into something completely unexpected. And along the way, I've definitely had a couple managers who were like, you don't seem exactly qualified for this, but I believe you could do it. So in your case, Sue, you're not currently working as a tech writer. So I'm going to tweak a couple of the questions that I normally ask folks. Just for everyone listening, you will recognize that these are slightly different from normal. But one of the questions I do typically ask is tech writer the best role title to use for this? We've had some folks who prefer documentarians. We have some folks who align more with kind of software or product documentation. And I specifically wanted you on here because I was like, I need somebody who's actually managed other people, who has been through the hiring process, who can speak to some of this a bit. Does tech writer play well on the resume front, on the highlighting skill front? Are there phrases or words people should be using that are different?
So I would advise everyone to list technical writer on their LinkedIn profile. You can also list other titles as well, but I think technical writer is the most common one that recruiters are going to search for. And obviously, you want to be found right. So even if you call yourself something completely different, Lord and Master of the documentation sphere or whatever else, you can list that as well, but make sure you list tech writer in there too.
Somewhere. Yes. So my Knowledge Owl title is Documentation Goddess. That is not necessarily the thing I use entirely on my resume, for example, ladies and gentlemen.
Probably wouldn't be something that someone was searching for.
No, it's a little out there for sure. And this kind of gets us into the fun nuts and bolts and really meat of this episode. So as I've hinted at already and kind of danced around a little, Sue and I connected through a friend of a friend, in essence. I reached out to somebody I knew who'd already been a guest on the podcast and was like, hey, I know you've done a little bit of people management now. And I feel like one of the big issues in our community is that we've got a lot of very talented people out of work right now and a lot of folks really looking for work. I think we all hit a point of desperation when we're out of work that we will start listening to the advice of any random person on the internet who suggests something
So
different than what we've done. No, you are the not random person, Sue. You are the person where I went, okay, I don't just want to give random advice from a rando on the internet. I want to find somebody who's actually managed a docs team, has done hiring in docs, and has worked with a wide variety of people. And you managed, what was it? You managed site cores. You were like director of documentation there, managing quite a few writers and various and other people, right?
Yeah, up to 30. It varied from time to time. And I'd say over my career, I've hired around 60 people. So definitely been through the process and obviously have my own way of doing it and my own opinions, but hopefully they'll be useful and there'll be some things that are applicable across the board, I think.
Yep. So just to be clear, we're not making Sue speak on behalf of every single hiring manager on the planet. We are just picking her brain as here is one hiring manager and here's what she looked for or did or asked. Just a sort of day in the life moment here. So no pressure. You are not speaking for all of hiring, but I feel like a lot of where people are struggling at this point is trying to get to an interview. They see something, they feel like their experience aligns really, really well with that role. They send a resume or a CV off, and then crickets, nothing happens. And so that feels to me like the part that people are trying to dial in and are struggling with. And so I wanted to begin there. Maybe let's start with, what are some do's and don'ts for your CV or your resume? What should people be focusing on or not focusing on in what they're sending?
I would say, the first thing is to make sure your resume reflects your skills as a technical writer. May surprise you guys, but I've received so many resumes that have multiple mistakes on them. And that's just not a smart thing to do when you're applying for a job as a writer. It should be obvious, but it isn't to everyone, unfortunately.
All right. So get a friend to proofread it, y'all. Start there.
Yeah. I mean, I would not advise you to use AI to write your resume for sure, but get it to check it. If you've not got anybody else to do that, it's pretty good at finding mistakes. Again, as a tech writer, you should be good at summarizing the most important material and explaining it in a concise and clear way. And again, do that on your resume. I actually had one once that was 26 pages long. Could you believe it?
You're kidding?
Nope.
26 pages? Wow.
They didn't want to leave anything out.
Wow. That is, bold. It is a choice.
Yeah, that was a choice.
I feel like the last time I went to like a career center, which was, we're going to say at least 10 years ago, the advice I was given is that you are allotted like one page for every 5 to 10 years of work experience, which always forced me to try to be as succinct as possible in that. I'm not sure if that's still the common guidance, but 26 pages would be excessive. Like you'd be pretty old if you were following that guidance.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would advise that you sort of have a longer CV if you've been working for longer. My own would be quite long if I did that. I would say usually try and keep it to 2 pages. I know in some countries it's the custom to squish it all into 1 page. I'm not a fan of that because I don't think you can explain enough in a single page. Maybe if you have a cover letter as well, but it's a bit tough. So keep it at 2, maybe 3 pages, not excessively long, and make it long enough so that you've got room to explain all the juicy stuff.
One of the debates I've kind of seen has been how much time do you spend making it look pretty versus how much time do you spend on the content that you're putting into it. And obviously none of us wants to hand in an unattractive thing. But from your perspective, hiring, how important was the sort of aesthetic of the document versus the content of the document?
So I would say it's almost, it's really not important as long as it's not kind of a blank page with text on it and nothing else, just lines and lines of text. Have a little thing to catch the eye, whether it's a use of color for headings or a sidebar or something else, but don't spend loads of time making it pretty. And unless you're good at it and you enjoy it, And there have been occasions where I think people have overdone that, and that's actually put me off, and they've obviously spent more care on how to present their words rather than the words themselves. And again, think about what role you're applying for, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're applying for maybe a tech writing position that includes some design and creation of visual assets, then it might be more relevant. Yeah. Whereas if you're, I don't know, largely working on maybe API documentation or something, it may not be as pertinent to dish out all the fancy colors and bells and whistles.
Exactly.
Okay. How should folks handle cases where they've got, I'm going to say, gaps in employment? Because we've got a lot of folks who have that right now, either because they were laid off 6 months ago, a year ago, year and a half ago, and haven't been able to find anything, or they've got a period like that a little bit farther back, but it would come up recently enough that you'd potentially have to handle that either in your application materials, your cover letter, in the interview. Where and how should somebody address that?
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I would say the best thing is to try not to hide it, because, it's going to be obvious looking through. You'll spot a gap between the years. And then if there's no explanation, I start to wonder what went on. Obviously, you don't need to give out personal details if it was a sickness or something like that, but try and summarize something to give some kind of explanation. You can talk about upskilling or just call it a career break. That's also fine. Just give it some kind of a label rather than just leaving a visible gap.
I mean, my own gap is about 6 months from when I basically took a career break to hike a very long trail. So I always ask this question because I'm like, what should I do about that 6-month gap in my resume? Which is what I typically say. Often, it's not always in my resume. Sometimes it's in a cover letter. Sometimes it's during the interview when somebody asks me about the gap. And I can be like, oh, yeah, I took 6 months off and hiked a really long ways by myself. And usually that's an interesting point of conversation, so it works out in my favor, but you can't ever tell. I saw an interesting question the other day from someone who had been a tech writer for a period of time and then tried to pivot out of the industry and was not successful in that, and so was now resuming applying for tech writing gigs and was a bit like, how do I handle this? Like, if I tell folks that like I took a chance trying to go somewhere else and that didn't work out, how do I then make myself seem still enthusiastic and like I care about doing this when I really did try to bail?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, but you could phrase it like, I tried this other thing out. It wasn't a great match to me. And so I'm coming back to the thing that I know and love. I mean, something like that.
I guess, is there anything else that I'm not thinking to ask here?
About the resume itself? One thing is make sure you read the advert. And again, it sounds obvious, but it's not okay to fire off the same resume to every single tech writing job. You're just going to come across as uninterested. So make sure you read the advert, pull out any points that seemed particularly important for the hiring manager, anything that's different to the average job, and try to address that in your CV. So you should be editing some of the content for every application, I'd say. And whether it's a lot or little will depend on the content of the job.
I know for myself, I will sometimes look through a job advertisement and I'll sometimes just tweak the language that I'm using in my CV so that it better reflects the language that appeared in the job description or whatever it might be. I figure a little bit of keyword hitting probably doesn't hurt me because the content is otherwise the same. Would you recommend taking that kind of approach if you're like, I generally do kind of use the same CV everywhere, but I do want it to feel like I actually paid attention to the job that I was applying for?
So I would advise you to do exactly that. And that's not because someone like me might be reading the application because I can translate and say, okay, that's the same thing. But it's because often the first person to look at your application is a recruiter, and they don't necessarily know that something you call A is the same as something that they call B. So that increases your chances of getting through the first pile as well. I mean, personally, I read every single application myself. I didn't ask recruiting to screen them for me because I could never give them a formula in terms of this is exactly the person I'm looking for. It's kind of like I know it when I see it, and maybe they don't have a relevant degree. They typically don't with tech writing. Maybe they don't have exactly the experience you'd expect, but sometimes you look at different things in the resume and think, that could work with that. And yeah, so personally, I read them all, but I think that's pretty rare. Often it's the recruiters that go for the pile first. So make sure that you think of them as well, and remember they're not so experienced in tech writing terms and so on.
It's a good point. The initial audience may not be the final audience. And so you're trying to create something that's going to kind of appeal to various steps in that, which maybe leads us into I think when you and I were talking about this, you mentioned something about understanding the local hiring culture. And I feel like maybe this is a good segue into that around do you understand, is it a recruiter who's going to be looking at it? Can you figure that out? Do you have a feel for what the process is going to look like? And therefore you can adjust what you're going to submit in that way. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So in terms of who's going to be looking at it first, you obviously don't always know, but if it's a larger company, then the likelihood is that the recruiter is going to look at it first. And if it's a smaller one, then perhaps it's just the hiring manager straight off. And cultures vary from country to country as well as from one company to another. For example, it was a surprise for me to learn that most companies in Denmark like you to include a photo on your CV, which is a big no-no in many other countries. So, if you've moved to another country and aren't familiar with the sort of hiring culture, then make sure you find out about that. Another thing in Denmark, which is perhaps unusual in other countries, is it's really common to call the hiring manager and introduce yourself and ask a few questions about the role. So,
wow. I would never think to do that. Never in a million years.
That was also news to me. But I mean, it's worth thinking about, right? I think we'll talk a little bit about how you can make yourself stand out from the crowd. And yeah, maybe that would annoy some hiring managers if they're busy, but others may welcome it. And if you actually get through to them and are allowed to talk to them, then you will stand out a little, right? Because they'll say, oh yeah, that was so-and-so that I chatted with earlier.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a cultural thing I never would have thought of. Also, not a space that I would be comfortable in generally as a candidate.
I mean, should we get onto that sort of elephant in the room, right? About are people using AI to screen resumes these days?
Let's.
So I think thankfully not a lot of companies are doing that already, but some are, I know. And I think it's a terrible, terrible thing because, as I say, I didn't really trust recruiters myself to find the right mix, and I certainly wouldn't trust AI. They just don't have enough knowledge about the context, and they won't be able to translate skills that are applicable but not an exact match and all those kinds of things. But, if a company's decided to do it, there's not much you can do about that. Try searching on the net, maybe if you're unsure, to see if there's any rumors that a particular company does it. If they do, then it's really important to do that kind of keyword loading and make it as easy for the engine as possible to translate, oh yeah, they match that one and they match that one and they've mentioned that one. But I think it's a horrible, horrible thing, and I hope it stops soon.
Fair enough. And is there anything else just from a general perspective to say, what else can you do to stand out? So you're trying to speak very much the language of the role. You are trying to maybe signal that you have understood some things about the way the company culture is or the hiring culture specifically is. What else is there other than let me dial in my documents and try to use the appropriate channels in the appropriate ways to make myself stand out? Which I realize is a really hard question.
Well, no, there's one really important thing, I think, which we haven't touched on yet, and that's to make sure that the hiring manager knows what your motivation is while you're interested in this particular role. If you submit a cover letter, then, a good chunk of your cover letter should be about that. And if you don't, then try and include it in a section at the top of your CV. For me, the most important thing when I'm hiring someone is enthusiasm. I would weigh that every time above experience. So if you can get that to come through in your application somehow, I think that's one thing that will help you stand out.
And actually, on that note, I think this is a great time for us to take a break. So stick with us. We will take a break and we will be right back in a few. This episode is sponsored by KnowledgeOwl, your team's next knowledge-based solution. You don't have to be a technical wizard to use KnowledgeOwl. Our intuitive, robust features empower teammates of all feathers to spend more time on content and less time on administration. Learn more and sign up for a free 30-day trial at knowledgeowl.com. And we are back with more from Sue Brandt. So Sue, there's something you said earlier that enthusiasm for you kind of outweighs experience, which I love. I have done a bit of hiring myself, and that often is the case for me as well, because I feel like someone who comes in really excited about the role and the work that it entails, any gaps that they might have in tool knowledge or something else, I feel pretty confident they're going to pick it up because of that enthusiasm. But it does lead into I'm applying for a job that I'm maybe not particularly qualified for, maybe because I'm pivoting from something, a different career, a different whatever, or this is maybe much more technical, or it's a very different audience that I've written for in the past or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about what it is for people who are trying to kind of make that pivot. How do they handle that in their application materials? What's a good way to try to make that translation to show that I haven't done this exact thing before, but here's why I would be successful in this role?
Again, when you're trying that approach, it's kind of potluck, really. Again, if you're going to hit a recruiter first, then you've probably got a lower chance of getting through if you don't match the criteria in the job advert, because that's what they're looking for. But obviously, give it a go. What you want to do is to explain why you think your existing experience and skills are applicable, at least to some extent. So do that translation. And then, obviously, again, convey the enthusiasm, which is going to be really important when you learn new stuff. And talk maybe about times where you've learned other stuff quickly or other transitions that you've made. Yeah, I guess that's those are the things I look for if I'm sort of taking a bit of a risk on somebody. You can sometimes get kind of a gut feel when you look for a resume that, hey, this person sounds super smart and they obviously want to do this and they've got this little piece over here that might be applicable. And I think this could work. And then obviously if you get to the interview, you'll make another assessment and have another gut feel about whether you still think that or not. But as I say, it can be difficult to get past a recruiter if they're the first person screening.
And we haven't really talked much about interview stuff at all, kind of by design. But I think this is a good one to talk about interview things a little bit, because I think if you can get to the interview stage and you're in a place where you aren't on paper the perfect fit, the interview is really the place where you can help yourself stand out enough to still get that role. And I guess I'm curious from your experience hiring, I'm guessing you've hired some folks who were very enthusiastic, but maybe not 100% qualified for what you hired them for. What are kind of the do's and don'ts in that situation from an interview perspective for one of those candidates?
A lot of the do's and don'ts are the same for any other kind of interview as well. And maybe we can go through a few of those as well. But in terms of somebody who's not an obvious fit, I guess it's kind of doing the same things I've already talked about for the application itself. Explain why you think the experience you have and the skills you have and maybe things you've done in your past time, whatever it is, anything, any kinds of little pieces of ammunition that can kind of count in your favor. And then show that you've done some research. For example, if you're coming into a tech writer role for the first time, make sure you've read about what tech writers actually do and can talk the language a little bit. Or if you're transitioning from a less technical writer to maybe a programmer writing role, maybe you want to have done a couple of online courses in software skills and so on, something to show that you're serious about moving in that direction.
And now I'm going to make you leap back the other direction, which is to say we've also somewhat neglected cover letters.
Ah, yes.
So I'm going to rewind us a tiny bit and say, is there anything folks should be focusing on doing or avoiding doing in cover letter?
Well, I think the two key things that you need to do, I know we've definitely talked on the sort of what's your motivation for the role and enthusiasm and so on. And the other thing is, this is your chance to map your experience onto the job requirements. So don't give the hiring manager the work of having to try and figure that out. If you send a CV, then there's often, or if you only send a CV, then there's a bit more work for the hiring manager to kind of extrapolate and think, oh, okay, then that situation may be like this one. I'm not quite sure. And in the cover letter, you can explain it. So I'm a fan of a cover letter, and I always read those before the CVs. But I know that there are varied opinions about that. And again, if all the applications are going past a recruiter and they're busy, they may not bother reading the cover letter, or they may ask you not to submit one. So yeah, again, if you can try and find out what the company prefers, that's the ideal thing.
And a lot of them are, at least in my experience, a lot of them are very clear about whether they want one or don't want one. Even just as simple as like, is there a place for you to upload this or not?
Yeah, and that's a good tip, right? Even before you're ready to actually apply for the job, press the apply button, and then you can see which files you're allowed to upload, and then you can save yourself some time if you can't upload a cover letter.
Yeah, although I do think even for places where you can't upload a cover letter, if you are, and maybe this is a terrible piece of advice, you can correct me if it is, but I feel like the action of writing a cover letter kind of forces you to do some of that explicit mapping between your experiences and what the role entails. And that can still be a useful exercise when you're getting into conversations with a recruiter or with a hiring manager. Because most of us do writing because we're often better at thinking on the page than we are thinking out loud. And so having gone through the exercise, even if you can't submit it, might be useful just to have like really thought through what are the best ways for me to showcase how I map my skills to what you're looking for.
I actually think that's a really good idea, because there are various situations in which you may be able to use it. So if you get to the interview part, then you can use it there for sure. If for any reason you end up talking to the recruiter or hiring manager before, then obviously use it there. And then the other thing is that it may prompt you to rewrite your CV a little bit to showcase a little bit more of that.
Oh, that's a good point. Maybe one other materials question. There are some applications that will encourage or require you to include a portfolio of the work that you have.
Yeah.
And because seeing a writer's previous work is often a very good way to gauge, are they going to be a good fit for the kind of writing that we do, for our style, for our conventions, whatever that might be. I don't know that I have a very clear question here, but I can say that this is one of the steps of the application process that I feel causes me an undue amount of stress to try to decide, what do I put in here? Because I want to pick some of my strongest work, but I also want to pick work that I feel demonstrates the exact skills that I think this role is looking for. And so there is sometimes this like, well, I haven't written anything like that in a while. Do I make up a sample and send that in? Should I pick something from like 3 years ago that's pretty close to what they're looking for, even though it's several years old at this point? Do you have any wisdom and guidance on picking portfolio content? Did you use portfolios? Maybe let me start there. Did you use portfolios in your hiring process?
I always want to see a sample of someone's writing before I decide if I'm going to interview them. So that's not to say that I ask everybody for that by any means. It's kind of when I kind of get towards the shortlisting stage. You don't have to have a fancy website or anything. It's fine to just send some files, and that will do. I kind of feel that 3 pieces is the sweet spot. You don't want to overload the hiring manager, but you want to choose 2 or 3 samples that shows sort of slightly different situations. So maybe if you're interviewing for a programmer writer position, you'd want to maybe have some API documentation, and then something that's a bit more conceptual to show that you can write something that's a bit less formulaic as well.
It is one of the big questions I see from new writers. So folks who haven't been tech writers in the past, and they know that they're going to have to submit some type of samples. And they're like, I don't really have a deep, broad portfolio of work to submit. And I think at that point, generating a sample or 2 that feels aligned without spending an achingly long amount of time doing it does make sense because you don't have that experience stuff. And you're just really trying to demonstrate that you have an understanding of, even a basic understanding of what tech writing entails and what you think the role is looking for. Okay, so 3 pieces. Do you have any definitely do not do pieces that are longer than X or shorter than X, or is it variable?
I'd say, yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to cut a piece off if it really is a long topic, but it would be better to send things that are maybe 1 or 2 pages rather than many pages. It may be fine to have one very short sample if it's showing something different to the others, and then 2 longer samples. Yeah, again, not too short, not too long.
You want to be Goldilocks, but we're not quite sure exactly where in the sweet spot Goldilocks is for a given hiring manager, right? One of the questions I get, particularly from younger writers, but not always younger writers, often it's those of us who haven't had to apply for something in a long time, is how in the weeds in our CV or our cover letter should we get on previous projects, tools that we've used, tech stack that we've worked on. I've seen some guidance that says you want to be hyper specific on this. I've seen some guidance that says you should only be hyper specific if it helps show the translation of the experience you have to the thing. I've seen other people who will literally list every single tool they've ever used in their application materials. So I'm assuming there's a sweet spot here. I'm hoping you can tell me where it is.
Yeah, so the word I fixated on in your question there was how in the weeds. So you're showcasing your skills as a tech writer, right? So you're not in the weeds. It is fine to mention tools and tech and projects, but again, don't overdo it. Give preference to anything that's listed in the advert. So if they ask for experience in a particular tool and you've used it, of course, mention that. Or if there's a tool that's similar, then mention that instead. Give a few examples of projects that showcase your achievements. Definitely don't list everything you've documented or every project you've done. Pick out a few things and you can say, for example, blah, 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 to show, yeah, obviously I've done more than this, but these are a few things that demonstrate what I can do. If the advert asks for particular technologies as well, then obviously list those if you have them or anything adjacent to that. If you're going for a programmer writer role, then list the languages that you know. If you've worked on particular tech stacks, that might be relevant as well. So again, it's that sweet spot. Customize it to whatever the advert's asking for and give a few examples, but not too many.
I feel like the answer in software is often, it depends. I feel like this one is a little bit, it depends. It depends what the company is looking for in the role. It depends what you have, and it depends how those things potentially map together. Sometimes I think it's, if you don't have experience with the exact tool, then mentioning an experience you have of coming up to speed quickly on a tool that you're unfamiliar with can at least say, hey, I've had to do something like this before.
So I'll share a secret with you. I personally think it's stupid to ask for experience in a particular documentation tool because any tech writer who's worth their salt will learn it in a couple of weeks, and sure, they'll become an expert over time, but it's not an issue. You've used one before, you'll translate, you'll get there very quickly. So yeah.
If you're a good tech writer, you're used to having to learn new things, sometimes very quickly, in order to explain them to others, or because that's just the nature of the business, is that every place you work has a different combination of tools or a different tech stack or whatever. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, since you've done a fair amount of hiring, what are the things that people do to kind of seal the deal when they're in the interview? Or what are the things people do that just sort of totally puts you off? And you're like, oh, coming into this, I thought I was going to hire you, but I'm not going to now. So I think that is kind of an interview do's and don'ts question, but I always kind of love hearing, because I think sometimes it's hard to actually articulate what makes one candidate stand out over another interview-wise. So I would love to pick your brain on this.
I'm obviously going to come back to my thing and say that enthusiasm is the clincher there. If I see someone who's got a great resume and they've got loads of experience and they've done all the same kinds of things before, and they come to an interview and it just seems like they're going for the motions and yeah, I can do this, whatever, they're not going to get hired, because that's just going to be soul destroying to work with them. I want someone who's, however good you are, you can always move on and improve and try new things, right? So that's what I want to see. But going back to basics, when you start off the interview, first thing to do is to smile, establish contact with the interviewer, and don't worry about being nervous, because they're going to expect it. They've done this before. They've seen other candidates. Most people are nervous to some extent, sometimes very nervous, and they should be ready to put you at your ease. So don't worry about that. If you're having an in-person interview, then obviously shake hands, have a bit of a small talk before you sit down. Maybe the hiring manager will kick that off, but if they don't, then do it yourself. Just make some kind of talk about the usual things, the weather, getting to the office, or whatever it is. Once you've got started, it's typical for the first question to be around why you're interested in this job. But if they don't ask it, try and work it into the conversation yourself. We've got another Goldilocks things in terms of how long your answers should be to questions. So more than one sentence normally, but don't talk for several minutes about one thing unless the hiring manager is asking follow-up questions and prompting you for more. Don't hog the conversation. They've probably got quite a few questions they want to get through. And then definitely prepare some questions, and you can use this as an opportunity to show that you've done your research. And again, that shows your enthusiasm for the role. For example, you could ask something specific about a particular feature in the documentation, and then it doesn't really need to be something that you're personally interested in, but it shows that you've been in there and looked in the weeds and you've done the research. A couple of don'ts. Don't say bad things about your previous employer or colleagues, even if that's the reason why you left your previous job. That's kind of a warning sign for the manager. It may be perfectly fair and just, and they were a complete idiot, but the hiring manager can't know that, and so there's no reason to mention it. And then the other thing is, don't monopolize the conversation so that the hiring manager doesn't get a chance to ask all the questions, but also don't sit there if there's a awkward gap.
Have you ever had somebody ask a question that the question itself made put you off?
Questions that are trying to be a bit too clever. So it's almost like you're trying to catch the company out or being overly critical. I think it's fine to identify something in the documentation that you don't like and mention that, and obviously explain why and how you think it could be done better. But don't ask a question that's purposely tricky and will be difficult for the hiring manager to answer. You'll come across as a bit arrogant, and that's not a great place to be.
So what is a great piece of advice that you have been given? It does not have to do with anything we talked about today.
So I'm not sure that this kind of fits into the interview as such, but it was actually from one of my previous managers where we just had a really, really stressful day, and he sat me down at the end and said, I'm going to tell you something that one of my previous managers said. Remember, this is just a job. Which I thought was really great, but I'm not sure that it's particularly applicable to hiring and getting yourself hired and stuff. It's once you're already there and trying to keep sane.
Yes, but it is still important advice for sure. I guess maybe to round it out, if people wanted to follow up with you or get in touch, would you be open to people reaching out to you?
For sure. Yeah. I'm very happy if people want to message me or link up, connect on LinkedIn. Happy to chat with more people, get more connections.
Fabulous. And I know that you are yourself working on a pivot into something different. Do you have a feel yet for what that different thing is?
I'm definitely hoping I can take the skills that I've learned along with me, so the people management side and maybe also the writing side. But I would love to work within sustainability. And maybe, who knows, maybe I've had a tech-writer job within sustainability. That would be a neat pivot. Or maybe there's a team out there who really needs me as a manager. That would be another great thing. But it's something I'm exploring. My sense is that it's going to be quite a difficult leap because most of the jobs are either for new graduates or for people who've got 10 years experience. So it may be something I have to drop at some stage and come back to what I know and love, as we said before. So, yeah.
Yeah, often I think it's worth being honest. Like, we can all be honest about this. You can enjoy something, but also still want to do something different. Like that's a very human thing. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It doesn't, like, that's not a thing you should be embarrassed about it in an interview. You can say, I'd been doing this. I felt really great at it. Maybe I hit a point where it wasn't feeling as challenging to me, or maybe this other area kind of came up on my radar and I realized I was really interested in that. And I was trying to see if I could kind of break into that. And that didn't work. So I'm back here with a thing that I know and love and that I'm great at, and hoping I can put my skills to use. Just a great note for us to end on, I think. So, Sue, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your generosity today. This has been a lovely chat. And I know I've learned a few things, so I'm hoping our listeners also have some takeaways here.
Well, that's great. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. It's been a pleasure.
The Not Boring Tech Writer is produced by the lovely humans at Astronomic Audio, with editing by Dylan, transcription by Alan, and post-production by Bean and Alex. Chad Timblin is our podcast head of operations. Our theme song is by Brightside Studio. Our artwork is by Bill Netherlands. You can check out Knowledge Owl's products at knowledgeowl.com. And if you want to work with me on docs, on knowledge management coaching, on revamping an existing knowledge base, go to knowledgewithsass.com. That's knowledgewithsass.com. Until next time, I'm Kate Mueller, and you are the Not Boring Tech Writer.